Now we're moving along with more of the nervous system. This is lecture 15, which is chapter 13 in your book on peripheral nervous system. So we're going to separate the different components of the nervous system to better understand them and make the information a little more palatable for us. So when we look at the peripheral nervous system, okay, basically it's very difficult to kind of anatomically separate the nervous systems because it is all interconnected, but what we can do is look at them functionally, what they do, kind of. So this is more of a functional distinction rather than kind of like an anatomical, even though we add an anatomical basis to it. So when we look at the peripheral nervous system, these are structures that function outside. It doesn't mean they're not, they're solely located outside the brain, but they're outside the brain and typically the spinal column. And this is going to include what we call sensory receptors, peripheral nerves associated with what are called ganglia, that means collections of nerve cell bodies, and what we call motor endings, that means neurons that actually do a job like move muscle, cause function in a gland or an organ. So when we look at the peripheral system compared to the central, again, functionally and kind of partially anatomically, it stands alone, even though the two of them work together. And we can divide the peripheral nervous system up into what's called the sensory or afferent division. Afferent means it senses emotions and that information is coming in. What we mean by emotions is your responses to the environment. And then, but the afferent also means to go into the body, information going in. And then there's the efferent, ef meaning going out. These are functions that leave the central nervous system and carry out an effect, usually related to the sensory system input. So the motor division can be broken up into what we call somatic nervous system, which means of the body, actual conscious things going on in the body. The autonomic nervous systems, which means things that your central nervous system kind of controls or is controlled within the autonomic nervous system itself, and you don't really have full conscious control over, even though there is some. And then the autonomic is broken down into sympathetic and parasympathetic functional and anatomical branches. So again, the motor is broken up into somatic, autonomic. The autonomic is broken up into sympathetic, parasympathetic, and the peripheral itself is composed of what we call sensory. That means incoming information and outgoing information. So when we look at sensory receptors, these are special nerve cells, typically special nerve cells, that their action potential is stimulated by some environmental factor or a hormone that is not, in many cases, a neurotransmitter. So this is very important to understand that many things could elicit an action potential. And in the case of receptors, these are the guys that do that. So their activation is generally graded. That means it takes a certain amount of activation to sometimes feel an impulse. And this is where you get this effect where a small stimulus produces a small response, a large stimulus your body interprets as a large response. And this varies with the number of receptors that are excited based on sensitivity of that receptor to an action potential. Okay, and usually what they're involved is the whole idea of sensation, meaning the conscious awareness of stimuli, which we sometimes call the affective or what we mean the emotional, the interpreting part of the brain. Now, how do we classify receptors? You're going to love this. Based on the stimulus type, their location, and their structural complexity. And this is what makes anatomy and physiology beautiful, because anatomists look at this, they look at that, but physiologists tend to sometimes look at that, and sometimes that, because it helps them determine why that stimulus type is there. So again, this gets to be a little crazy, and just bear with me as we name these sensory structures. So when we look at classification by stimulus type, this is probably more important to you than anything else, particularly when we get into the special senses, is that we have what are called mechanoreceptors, which respond to different degrees of touch, pressure, vibration, stretch, and itch. Then there's thermoreceptors. They're kind of related to mechanoreceptors, except your body interprets them as changes in temperature. they feel the vibrational frequency of the air, of the outside environment, and they interpret changes of that as temperature. That sounds kind of weird. You feel changes. That means differences between your body temperature and the outside temperature. That's why you can actually have a temperature on the outside that's equal to your body, and in a way you kind of feel comfortable and say, I don't feel hot, I don't feel cold. That's because they are not sending a signal. So it's really, when we mean the changes, that means the differences, not only in temperature change, but between the difference between your body and the environment. Then there's photoreceptors. They use light energy called photons and special components in the receptor called pigments to determine light. That means the presence or absence of light, or the color of light, which actually has to do with the wavelength of light or the frequency. There's chemoreceptors. They detect chemicals that are not classified as neurotransmitters. So these are more chemicals that float in our blood, like carbon dioxide, some cases oxygen. They can detect fragrances, foods, other stuff. And then there's nociceptors, okay, which are sensitive to pain. And they could feel tissue damage, excessive pressure, and usually they respond to inflammatory chemicals. That's their typical responses. They tell the body damage is going on. By location, we have what are called Xtaro receptors, which obviously means they respond to external stimuli. It means they respond to the environment. So these are the ones that tell you your skin is touched. They tell you pressure on the skin, pain, temperature, obviously. And these are found particularly in what we call your sense organs, your special sense organs, which we will cover a little later. And then there's what are called Xtaro or Viscera. The old term is visceral, meaning organs. These are receptors that lie on your organs, and they determine a variety of things, including tissue stretching, inflammatory chemicals, temperatures, you name it. So and these determine the internal environment. These are both part of your overall what's called external and internal homeostasis. So by location, that means where are these found? This is a separate classification. So there's a receptor called a proprioceptor. Proprioceptor is a more common way to spell it and refer to this term. So proprioceptors, because they abbreviated it because it got a little tricky, is these are mechanoreceptors. They respond to stretch, but particularly in skeletal muscles, tendons, joints, ligaments, and connective tissue and bones. So if you go home and try to pull your skin out all the way, or try to pull a finger back past the point where you could extend it anymore, you are feeling proprioreceptors or proprioceptors. Okay. When we look at complexity, we can look at some examples of complex receptors and simple receptors. And that means some receptors are inside a protective capsule that basically allows them to do their job without getting damaged, or allows them to be separate from the surrounding tissues to particularly do their job. And then again, just don't worry too much about this really, because complex could also be, like the eye, where it's multiple receptors working together as one. So simple could be very simple, like a bare nerve ending, somewhat simple, like what we call encapsulated, or they can be so complex it's an organ in itself. So when we look at these, I'm not going to make it memorize a table. It just shows you what simple ones look like. Okay, here are some simple receptors that are just exposed nerves or somewhat encapsulated. Okay, and they're basically doing a particular job, particularly in the skin we see here. Then we can see here, these are simple encapsulated. That means they're just surrounded by a covering that helps them to sense the environment, particularly on pressure, because you don't want to put pressure directly on the receptor itself, but you want to go through a covering of some type, which could be glial cells, it could be connective tissue, it all depends. So these, again, it's basically one neuron or a bunch of neurons encapsulated, but still kind of exposed to the environment, and they're working somewhat in a very simple manner or in unison. Okay, now, when we start looking at what receptors do, what is their job? They look at, and I mean, they are detecting information, usually within the body or outside of the body, and they're sending specific signals to particular regions of the brain so they can go to a particular area that's involved in vision or balance or hearing. They can go to a particular area for processing, like the thalamus, where this gets interpreted to a motor function or gets interpreted as a complex sensory function. That means you don't just detect a chemical and sense its presence, you interpret its presence right here, what we call somatosensory cortex. So the incoming signals from receptors can be very simple or very complex, and the most complex ones are the ones that go through what's called the thalamus and your limbic system, because they're sometimes attached to memories and emotions, particularly sensory structures associated with smell and taste and pain, and sometimes vision. Vision gets very complex. Now, another feature of receptors is something called adaptation. That means receptors can change in their sensitivity based on experience and based on, constant signaling. They eventually just get sick of signaling that they shut down in a way. And we call this up and down regulation, which is, you find it in some typical neurons, but this is most evident in sensory structures because this is the way they basically evolved and adapted. So they can develop a mechanism where they make their membrane receptors less responsive by either decreasing the amount of receptors or increasing them to make the cell more sensitive or less sensitive. They could also decline the frequency of a response or stop. That means they could affect their neurochemistry to make themselves more receptive to an action potential or not. And this is why sometimes if you have you're outside, produce a lot of body odor, and you don't notice it after a while, but everybody else does, that's because you kind of, what we call down-regulated your ability to detect the body odor, because basically you say, okay, I know I smell, I'm tired of it now, quit sending that signal. And also when you're sitting on your butts, initially you feel the chair, and then you don't need to feel it anymore, because you don't want every 5 seconds coming into your brain, I feel a chair, I feel a chair, I feel a chair. It's like an annoying kid that keeps repeating themselves. So this adaptation is very important in keeping you sane and allowing your brain to focus on more important things. Now, that's receptors. Now let us look at this special group of nerves called cranial nerves, because they are an important part of the peripheral nervous system besides receptors. We're going to see that they are main communicators for the brain, are involved in also the autonomic nervous system. So cranial nerves are 12 special pairs of nerves that are mixed function. That means they can be sensory or motor, and sometimes these two are linked, or they can be associated with other aspects of the nervous system. We number them 1 through 12 today because nobody can remember the darn names. Okay, we do have names for them. Okay, and that are traditionally used. Believe me, there's a couple you're going to need to know in A&P 1 and 2. Okay, because of what they do. So these 12 cranial nerves we see come out of the base of the brain. And what they usually do is exit through openings in the bottom of the skull that lead directly to muscles and organ systems. And they number them from the most anterior to the posterior. And these tend to also be superior and inferior. And we can number them from, again, 1 to 12, going all the way back. And I'm not going to make you memorize all of these, but you're going to have to know at least the names of some of them because they're going to come back to you, in the second semester. And some of these are pretty obvious. So we have over here the olfactory, which are the ones we see first. And then we're going to see they're involved in smell. And then number 2, the optic is also an important one because these are going to be involved in vision. And then we start getting down to, next to the optic, ones that control basically that help to control the eyes. That's important to have it near the optic nerve itself. And then I'm going to see ones that eventually control facial features and perceive pain in bodies, and we go on and on and on. And we'll see some are ranked to controlling the tongue, balance. This one is heavily involved in cardiovascular regulation and respiratory regulation, the vagus, and also digestion. This is one of the longest of the nerves that has the most impact on the body. And then ones that also work together with swallowing and speech. So these all have particular purposes. Please at least recognize the names and know that when you see these are cranial. Your book gives you a lot of avenues for seeing what they do, and it also tells you whether they have some type of motor or sensory function. And in some cases, both, because don't forget these are nerve tracts, not neurons. So some of the neurons are sensory in a nerve tract, some are motor, and this is very important in regulating how these work. And some important ones, again, in the olfactory and the optic. Trigeminal is a very important one in understanding pain. Same is true for facial, particularly with shingles diseases tend to live in these. Vestibulocochlear is involved in sound and balance. Okay, glossopharyngeal is very important in swallowing and tongue and also in vocalization. Vagus, we mentioned, is very important in basically almost all internal organs. And this one is very important in regulating the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. You'll see later. That means heart rate, digestion, all of that. So these are important. And be familiar with the names, again, because you'll be using these a lot when you look at what organ systems they're associated with and what they do. Okay, unrelated to cranial nerves are spinal nerves. Spinal nerves come in 31 pairs. And unlike cranial nerves, they originate from the vertebrae. So we have 8 cervical spinal nerves, 12 thoracic. This is how many vertebrae there are too. 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 scrawny little coccygeal, which actually doesn't really pass totally through the coccyx vertebrae, but it passes out through the first one. So let us see what these spinal nerves look like. They branch out from the spinal cord. That means they actually originate in there, but they're called peripheral because they do their job on the outside. Remember that, not on the inside, on the outside. They communicate with the inside within the central nervous system. So we got your cervical, your thoracic, your lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. And pay attention to these things right here. These are called plexi. Notice these are very simple pathways. These are very complex that interweave and spread out. And notice these go into the appendages, to your back and to your leg. And these control complex actions of your arms, your legs, and your butt, basically your hips. They're associated with incredible agility, complex movements of your hands and arms and legs, and also posture and movements of your back and abdomen. So the whole idea of a plexus, and notice for the neck too, you have a plexus there. That's also a coordinating feature for the shoulders and for head movement. So when we look at the spinal nerves, now understand these are not neurons, these are nerve tracts. So there's 2 nerve tracts for each vertebra, each segment of spinal cord. And then these are divided into front and back. That means each one. That means ventral root, dorsal root, or anterior posterior, however you want to look at that. This is actually really ventral dorsal because it refers to your thorax and your abdomen. So the ventral root usually deals with motor stuff, efferent information. The dorsal root, that means that towards the back of your spine, deals with what's called afferent or sensory information. And this is very critical when we look at this and look at damage to the vertebral column, because if damage occurs to the spinal cord and it's on the anterior region, that means, let's say someone is stabbed and that knife or even shot and that bullet hits the spinal column. And if it does spinal cord damage, it will affect, generally if it's superficial, the ventral root and affect motor function. If there's damage to the back through whatever, a hit, whatever, that could damage the sensory without it affecting the ventral or motor. So let us look at this anatomically. So there's the body of your vertebrae, which means this is your anterior perspective, because remember, you have the little processes towards the back of the vertebrae. There's your foramen, vertebral foramen, and this is now your spinal cord. And there's what's called the anterior root, posterior root. And this looks like a little butterfly. Think of the top of the wings of the butterfly as your posterior and the bottom of the wings of the butterfly as your anterior. And there's your roots right there. You have your dorsal and ventral roots of each one. This is showing you a plexus, just to show you what one looks like. Here's your cervical plexus. That means nerves that have both sensory and motor function are basically going through this thing, splitting, sharing, whatever, and mixing. And this allows to have incredible coordination of your appendages, okay, or in the case of moving your head or moving your torso. So just understand that a plexus just allows one nerve to split and integrate with other nerves to control muscles very precisely and to control muscle groups very precisely and get information from other regions. This almost allows a communication between all of these nerve tracts. So guys, when we look at how, these spinal nerves work, again, is very complex, and you have to pay attention to, and this is what neurosurgeons have to do, and anatomists have to do, is have to pay attention to the anterior divisions, the posterior divisions, what are called the trunks and the roots of all these features of the peripheral nervous system. Again, another plexus. Again, you have to pay attention to the roots of these, what trunks they're nearby. Trunks are just collections of these, so we have to pay attention to that, and whatever. I mean, just understand the complexity, particularly for your appendages and your lower body. Now, these are something called dermatomes. Okay, what this means is that in general, for the simplest way of looking at particularly what we call a reflex. That means looking at the ability for an Xtaro receptor to communicate to the body and back. How can we map this in your body, which vertebrae this is going through? Because this helps a lot when there's damage. Let's say someone damages that part of their back. What is going to be affected as far as, the function of the body? And what nerve tracts are going to be affected? And what, of course, motor parts and what sensory receptors. So what we can do is look at the body and in general say, wow, the Xtaro receptors here and motor units here are due to spinal nerve C4, which corresponds with your cervical vertebrae number 4. So just look at this. I mean, the sacrum is what controls that part of your external genitalia. And when you look at the arms, this is kind of funny, that doesn't make sense, but the arms are mostly controlled by cervical vertebrae. So damage to the neck could actually prevent the function of an arm. And look at that, there's a little thoracic influence in there too, funny enough. And look at the legs. A lot of them are controlled by not just lumbar, but sacral. So there's different nerves for the inner leg versus the outer part of your leg. So just look at this and appreciate it. Sometimes these are used in acupuncture and other types of non-traditional medicine, but don't overinterpret these. This is a general map sometimes that neurosurgeons use to look at, particular aspects of these spinal nerves and which ones are working properly, which are not, and which are communicating to the body, which are not. Now, we're going to kind of finish this up with looking at a pathway that's unique to the peripheral nervous system. That means we don't need the brain sometimes to do things. I know a lot of people don't use their brain to do things, but the idea of a reflex means it's a response that your brain knows about, but it's too late for it to control it. And in some cases you can with training. But usually a reflex is something that occurs in response to a signal and the brain didn't have time to catch up to it. But we want these because sometimes you don't want the brain to be responsible for conscious control of everything. Reflexes are used in rapid responses. That means like your arms, usually in a pain response of some type. They're also used for body posture and for coordinating the holding of stuff and walking up steps. So these are inborn. That means they're born and woven by the way your neural networks are made, your pathways are made. And some of them are learned because you practice them with repetition, like driving, for example, and walking up steps and walking in general. So the simplest unit of a reflex is called a reflex arc. And the reflex arc we're going to see has several components. The receptor, which is what causes the body to have a reflex. It detects the environment. And there's your sensory neuron, which is going to transmit the information from that receptor to the central nervous system. Now, the central nervous system is not going to control this. It's just going to be a way station. You'll see in a minute. It actually diverts the information away from the brain in a way to allow the body to control this on its own. So you have the sensory information coming in. It goes to the sensory nervous system. Usually, in most of the reflexes, we're going to learn the spinal cord. There's an integration center, which means this is going to interpret the signal. Where does it go? In the brain, this interprets your emotions with it, but not always the case. Then that integration center is going to take that sensory information and say, here's what we need to do. And this is why your spinal cord is a bunch of little mini brains. And then it's going to cause a motor response. That means either a gland secretes, an organ does something, or a muscle contracts. And there we go. There's the recipient. This is what the motor neuron controls. So reflex arc, very simple thing. But let's look at one. So let's look at what's called the knee-jerk response. So what happens is that in a knee-jerk response, that means I can hit you in your lower leg or right around the kneecap, and a sensory receptor detects that. It sends a signal, and the signal travels along the back of the spinal cord. This is afferent information, okay? And that's your little sensory nerve right there. Remember, sensory nerves kind of look like that. Motor neurons have the body here and this axon like that. And that's what you're going to see down here. So there's your sensory neuron. The signal goes from the skin to the sensory neuron. And then there's this thing called the interneuron, which is the integration center. And there's more than one, believe me. It will send information up to the brain, to other parts of the body, maybe across here, to let the other half of the body know what's going on. But its main job is to send a signal from that sensory receptor to this effector neuron. So there's that effector neuron there, and it sends a signal to the muscle that says kick, jump, whatever. This receptor works, this system, reflex works well sometimes when someone startles you. It sends this reflex signal that makes you jump or sometimes run without even thinking about it, before the brain even knows what went on. Okay, last but not least, there's a lot of misconception about nerve damage. We mentioned this earlier. Neurons are amitotic. That means under normal circumstances, unless they're a precursor cell or a stem cell, they cannot undergo mitosis. This is true for skeletal muscle too. So that means for the most part, and this is true in humans only, is when a neuron dies, that is it. Glial cells can be replaced. Not neurons unless there are stem cells in there waiting to replace them. So they cannot replicate. That means a neighboring cell cannot replicate a new dead neuron. Okay, if the body of a neuron is damaged, okay, it can kill the whole thing. If the axon is damaged, okay, but the body is okay, then this can regenerate. So you can't regrow a whole axon, but an axon that's mildly damaged, particularly away from the body, can heal itself with the help of glial cells and other cells. So with regeneration for a nerve fiber, that means to reheal. The neurons can't be dead, they can be damaged. And then what happens is that you get an inflammatory response, Macrophages, they remove the debris. They allow, um, you know, immune system cells to come in to do their job. Then Schwann cells, when we learned about these, they wrap around an axon. Schwann cells, what they do is they actually rebuild the area. They tell the nerve where to grow to. Sometimes they make a mistake, but they basically form like a tube that eventually the axon regenerates into. Okay, and don't worry about this part here, but this is a very important process when we look at nerve cell damage. I'm not talking about neuron death. So this is showing the phases of when an axon particularly is what you damage the most. With a pinched nerve or a knife slice, you usually hit. A nerve is basically a bundle of axons. If you damage a ganglion, you just killed these boogers or harmed them. So when you hit an actual nerve, it's a collection of ganglia. Of axons. And what happens is the axons tear. You now have a gap. And what happens is immune system cells come in. They clean up the old dead Schwann cells, all the dead nervous system, the nerve material. And what happens then is they work together now, now Schwann cells come in and they form a covering around that where now other white blood cells come in related to the macrophages that help to clean up mess and then start helping the rebuilding and refitting of the axon. So when this axon is destroyed in that little section, what happens is you can heal it, fix it, and put that section back together. So this ends our covering in the peripheral nervous system.